Hi folks, my name is Adam and I like to make tiny nerdy things. And from time to time, I like to reimagine my childhood through the lens of a tired, jaded adult. So the goal today is to make a more gritty and realistic version of Winnie the Pooh. As always, I'll start by making the armature, which I'll get the correct size for by tracing out my lifelike feces Winston. I'm gonna need a nice sturdy piece of wire, so I'll cut up some of my thickest gauge wire, then wind the two pieces together with my drill, leaving me with a strand of nigh unbreakable aluminium DNA. Then a little wrapping, snipping, and bending, and I've got a pretty accurate Ursine skeleton ready to be mounted. Now, Pooh Bear is a pretty chunky boy, and clay is at a premium these days, so I'm gonna bulk the majority of his body out with aluminium foil. Otherwise, with the body built up and the armature in place, I can finally start adding the clay. Now, I've never sculpted a bear before, but I have made lots of big chunky muscly men, and what's a bear but a chunky muscly man wearing a fur coat? So to that end, I'm gonna follow the same principle here by adding a bunch of clay until I'm happy with the general shape before I even start to worry about the details. Once the overall body shape is in place, I'll start from the top and work my way down. I like to be hands-on when I'm sculpting, and if I start on the bottom and work my way up, I'll inevitably smoosh all the detail I've already made, whereas working from the top to bottom means that I can just shift my grip downwards until I'm holding the base, thereby preventing a case of ugly crying after a day's sculpting is ruined. Oddly enough, it took me a few tries to figure out how a bear's face works, since I kept putting its eyes too far apart and I had flashbacks to that monstrosity that was my first few attempts at making my king shark sculpture. What is that? That being said, I did eventually crack the code, and I think I nailed a pretty good growly bear. So with the face mostly done, it's time to start adding the grizzly bear details that will take our turd Bruin from a bitey face torpedo to a chunky-necked king of the Canadian wilderness. I'd also like to point out just how much of a difference giving him ears makes. I'll pull the clay from his upper leg to pad out the foot and then carve out 5 big bear toes before sticking pre-made curved claws in place. Now I've made these out of Cosclay so they're a little more durable, and a dab of bacon bond on the end will hold them in place. Now Winnie might be English, but he's a card-carrying Second Amendment supporter, so I'll make sure that he's got 2 bear arms in the same way that I've made his feet. The only difference here is that unlike his feet, you'll see the undersides of his front paws, so I'll make sure to add the paw pads to both. Then it's on to adding the final details to his mouth, so I'll stick his tongue in place, then add some big incisors in the front, before adding little worms in between and beside the tongue, which will act as his plant smooshing molars. Then it's finally time for fur, so I'll start by marking out his Ursine treasure trail, which delineates his center line, before marking out where I'll put his red shirt. To make his fur, I'm basically just scraping back and forth with my spoon tool to give the surface a somewhat furry texture. I'd played with the idea of adding individual clumps of fur then texturing those, but after about an hour I realized that, despite it taking roughly 3 times as long, it didn't seem to make any difference in the end. After all, it doesn't need to look good, it just needs to look good enough. For a little added surface detail though, I'll scrape the surface with a nylon brush, then go over the entire model with a bit of isopropyl alcohol. This will help to remove some of the rougher cuts and soften up the edges a little bit. With the fur finished, I can add his fancy red shirt, so I'll start by wrapping the edges in some long wormy dealies, then blending those into the surface I've left bare. I'll do the same thing to the arms before attaching a wider, flatter worm that will act as his popped collar. Finally, some more strategically placed worms around the shirt will act as the folds and ripples. Once they're all in place, I'll blend them into the body and then gently roll over them with my shapers. And then once they're blended into the shirt and Pooh Bear is looking like a college frat boy named Brad, it's time to make his patented pot of honey. I'll start by rolling out a ball of clay, then snipping the end off and scooping out its guts. Then I'll throw it in the oven to bake and smooth it with progressively gentler sandpaper. Then I can add the little lip around the top, attach some inexplicably gray honey, then hand it off to my chunky boy who's ready for a finishing bake. Otherwise, once he's out of the oven, that's our Pooh Bear built and he's ready for his first coat of Polar Bear Primer. The Polar Bear Primer is pretty important here since Pooh Bear's got a yellowish orange coat and painting yellow or orange is one of the worst experiences I can think of. However, I happen to have a bottle of contrast paint that should leave me with a pretty perfect surface color and a nice dark highlight in a single coat. Then I can paint his red shirt red and I'll add some lighter highlights along the edges of the folds and seams. His honey pot gets painted brown with a lighter beige center, then the honey will get a bright yellow honey yellow highlight. Now I'll give his fur a quick dry brushing of yellow, which I probably should have done before painting any of the other colors, since it now means I need to be a lot more careful. Then I'll paint his mouth and teeth appropriately mouth and teethy colors. His nose and eyes get painted black and his various claws and nails get painted various claw and nail white. And finally, I'll coat the honey in a little UV resin. I've also left the resin only half cured so that it's still sticky. Otherwise, my bear is done and it's time to make him a base. Once I've gathered up all the necessary ingredients, I'll start by making a cup of mud. This is 1 part modeling paste, 1 part sand, 1 part brown paint, 1 part more brown paint, and 1 part even more brown paint. This gets mixed together until I've got a nice chunky chocolate paste, and then I'll slap it onto my MDF base. Now, one of my favorite things to do is to repurpose ordinary objects as tiny variants. So to make the rocks that litter my base, I'm gonna use rocks. Once my mud is dried, I'll apply a thin layer of black wash, ensuring it gets into all the nooks and crannies before wiping any of the excess off. Then I'll give it a quick dry brushing to highlight the edges before moving on to my favorite part of any base, static grass. I'll stick my grass to my mud by coating the base in PVA glue using the smallest brush I could find. Then I'll lay out some cardboard to collect the lawn cuttings before applying a very healthy dosage of static grass. Then I'll drill a couple of holes in the base so that I can stick my Ursine companion in place. Now, if you want to appreciate a loving, sweet, innocent, honey-loving, realistic Pooh Bear, then go ahead and stop the video here. However, for my part, I want this to turn dark. Like, real dark, real quick. And to do that, we're going to need to make a few nondescript pieces of clothing. I'll start with a nice flat sheet of clay that I can cut a totally non-identifiable yellow shirt out of. Then I'll add a white collar and some white trim around the sleeves. Then I'll cut some pretty deep ragged claw marks into the middle. I'll rip the rest of it apart as messily as I can before folding it on itself so it looks like a discarded shredded shirt that could totally belong to anyone. Then once it's baked, I can glue it to the base under Winston's feet before adding a sock and a shoe that I made off camera. Then a little red wash applied liberally all over the shirt, the ground, the sock, the shoe, and the rocks will help paint a picture of what's happened. Finally, I'll add a little bit of the same red wash to Pooh Bear's paws and mouth to really hammer home the point that this is an enraged wild animal that's recently gone on a honey-fueled rampage through a strawberry bush. Otherwise, we're on to the Glamour Shots. As always, a huge thank you to my wonderful patrons of Patreon who continue to support the creation of these awful sculptures for this ridiculous channel. And a very special shout out to my newest patrons, Ali, Alice Wiley, Aaron Vargas, Von Cat Artistry, Xiang Kwang Chen, Carly Nelson, Bishop, Pix Retro, Brandon Sapp, Justa Degan, Pokemom, Dark Lego 75, Jonathan Mead, Dread Bunny, Ian Zander, Martin Garcia, Lily Allure, Sam Potter the Wizard, Sarah Kessel, Hopscotch Pebblepot, T, Kitra Monnier, John, and Mignon Officina. You are the 600 kilogram golden murder mammal that guards this honeypot of a channel. If you'd like to help me make silly stuff, or you just really want to hear your name at the end of a cursed video, then head on over to Patreon and have a wee gander. Otherwise, we'll see you next time. Cheers.